Hello and welcome to our next lesson in the series on More Than Happiness, a study of Philippians. This week we will be in our third lesson, which we're entitling The Joy of the Good News of Jesus. And this was taught on the 20th of January 2022 in a Zoom class for the British Bible School. Paul had a great desire to proclaim the good news of Jesus in Rome. Warren Wiersbe, in his commentary on Philippians, Be Joyful, wrote, "More than anything else, Paul's desire as a missionary was to preach the gospel in Rome. The hub of the great empire, Rome was the key city of its day. If Paul could conquer it for Christ, it would mean reaching millions with the message of salvation. It was critically important on Paul's agenda, for he said, after I've been there, speaking of Jerusalem, I must also see Rome, Acts 19:21. From Corinth, he wrote, so as much as is in me is, I am ready or eager to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. He wanted to go to Rome to teach people about Jesus. And he finally ended up in Rome. But not, I think, as he was thinking it would happen. He ended up in Rome as a prisoner. In our last lesson, we saw the love and concern that Paul had for the Christians in Philippi as we looked at the opening of the letter of Philippians. We also saw the love and concern that they had for him. And we saw Paul's prayer for them, for love that overflows more and more with knowledge and insight. Now keep in mind that Paul is a prisoner. Now he's not in a dungeon, but he's under house arrest, chained at all times to a Roman soldier. So my photograph here that I took in the Creation Museum is not a display that would represent Paul during the time that he was a prisoner, but because he would be chained to a guard. And a good chance that possibly he was not the one who actually penned this. But we'll talk about that later. But that he's a prisoner comes out more in the section of text that we want to consider in this particular lesson. F.F. Bruce, in his commentary on Philippians, wrote, the Christians of Philippi were deeply concerned about Paul. They cherished a warm affection for him. They knew that he was now in custody awaiting trial, that his case was due to come up for hearing before the supreme tribunal of the empire. How was he faring right now? And what would be the outcome of the hearing once it took place? How, moreover, would its outcome serve the advance of the gospel throughout the Roman world? Paul knows what is in their minds, and he proceeds to reassure them, to impart to them something of the confidence that fills his heart as he contemplates the situation. The text opens, verse 12. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that my situation has actually turned out to advance the gospel. The whole imperial guard and everyone else knows that I am in prison for the sake of Christ. And most of the brothers and sisters, having confidence in the Lord because of my imprisonment, now more than ever dare to speak the word fearlessly. So Paul begins the next part of this letter by relating what is happening around him in Rome. It does sound like a reply to an inquiry that maybe they had sent, asking about Paul's conditions as a prisoner. Ralph Martin in the Tyndale commentary on Philippians said, again he's quoting from the King James Version here, I would ye should understand suggests that the Philippians may have either written or sent a message by Epaphroditus. We'll meet him in chapter 2, verse 25, to express their concern about his safety and welfare. Paul wants them to know these things. Several commentators that I've read have emphasized how Philippians is more of a letter between friends than a theological statement, although there is good teaching in this letter. It was emphasized that it's even difficult to outline this letter because he flows so readily between topics as friends do in conversation. In fact, some even refer to this letter as Paul's love letter to the Christians in Philippi, and I can understand why they would call it that. Notice that he addresses the Christians here. I want you to know, brothers and sisters. Now, most translations, at least the modern translations, go with brothers and sisters. The Greek word literally is brothers, adelphoi, but the reason translators have included both male and female Christians in cases like this is that there is considerable non-biblical evidence that the plural adelphoi, literally brothers, was used to mean both men and women in a group when it's used. It could have just as easily been translated fellow Christians. I mean, that would have worked as well. You would think that being a prisoner would curtail Paul's influence and being able to teach, let alone what it would do to the reputation of Christians and the cause of Christ. So there's some things that he wants them to know. And so this is what he's going to address here. Did being a prisoner curtail his influence and his ability to teach? Tom Wright points out, quite accurately, in his Paul for Everyone, for a traveling apostle to be put in prison must have seemed like a concert pianist having his hands tied behind his back. How can he possibly continue the work he's been called to do? In fact, some scholars refer to the 2 years preceding these two when he was in Rome. Those were the years when he was in prison in Caesarea Maritima. They refer to those as his silent years. I somehow doubt they were silent, because he would have been in contact with local Christians who undoubtedly helped him in supplying whatever he needed. Luke recorded in Acts chapter 24, then Felix, who understood the facts concerning the way more accurately, adjourned their hearing, saying, when Lysias, the commanding officer, comes down, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to guard Paul, but to let him have some freedom, and not to prevent any of his friends from meeting his needs. Now, we don't have any recorded letters that he wrote during those 2 years. That's not to say that he didn't write any, just that God did not preserve any of them. Although, having said that, he very well could not have written any. But we just don't know. There's nothing recorded. So, I'm not sure that they were silent years, in that he was totally cut off. He wasn't doing any teaching. I think based upon this text in Acts 24, he does have people coming, and so he would have been teaching. But as we continue in the text, notice Paul's reaction to his current circumstance of being a prisoner and chained constantly to a Roman soldier. He says, this has helped to advance the good news of Jesus. Ralph Martin comments on this, the phrase prokepe to evangelio. He says the meaning of this phrase is advancement in spite of obstructions and dangers which would block the path of the traveler. So you might think that being a prisoner would have been a hindrance to him. But the thing is, it wasn't. Paul might have been in chains, but the Word of God was not in chains. Wiersbe wrote, little did the Romans realize that the chains they affixed to his wrists would release Paul instead of bind him. I like that comment. I think this well illustrates what Paul had earlier written to the Christians in Rome, when he said in chapter 8, verse 28, And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. It goes back to something we've emphasized in previous lessons. We can either allow our circumstances to control us, or we can turn them over to God and do what we can to glorify him. And I would suggest that is what Paul did, that he was going to allow God to work through him in a circumstance that he would not have wanted. Because of Paul being a prisoner, he writes that the entire imperial guard knew about it and knew he was a prisoner. The Greek word there literally is, knew about his bonds for the sake of Christ. It was because of Jesus the Messiah. F.F. Bruce points out that the Greek literally is that my chains are in Christ. See, he was a prisoner because he was following and proclaiming Jesus, and not because he had done anything wrong, because he hadn't. F.F. Bruce said, it's not simply that Paul's imprisonment is due to his being a servant of Christ. That's true. But in his eyes, it's part of his life in Christ, to whom he is united by faith. It is especially part of his sharing in the sufferings of Christ. This phrase, imperial guard, the Greek word there is praetorium. It has two possible references. It can refer to the elite soldiers stationed in Rome and also in other areas, or it could refer to the headquarters of the administrators of a province. And depending on which commentator you're reading, you might find either of those mentioned as what this means here. I believe the most probable meaning here is that it's referring to the Praetorian guards in Rome. It's referring to people rather than places. And by the way, if you're reading from the King James Version, it does add a word in here which shouldn't be there, because it adds places into the text. As Paul had appealed to the emperor, he's now the emperor's prisoner while he waited for his case to be heard. So it would be natural that the soldiers guarding him were part of the imperial bodyguard. Of course, undoubtedly being chained to a Roman every hour of every day had its advantages. Yet we could naturally see the disadvantages, but it would undoubtedly have its advantages. Usually, from what I understand, there were 4 shifts of soldiers. Each soldier would be chained to their prisoner for 6 hours at a time. That means that there would be 4 different men with Paul each day. And they may not have been the same men every day. One writer I was reading suggested that if it was a different soldier all the time, I don't think it was, but if it was a soldier on each shift, a different soldier, he could have been influencing around 3,000 soldiers over the 2-year period. I think most likely it would have been different soldiers. It would not have been different soldiers each day. I think there would have been a continuity, at least in some of them. But as Warren Wiersbe wrote, can you imagine being a soldier and chained to a man who prayed constantly? See, when Paul spoke to people, those soldiers had to be there. And it seems that they were listening. F.F. Bruce commented that he claims no converts among either group, but he's filled with encouragement because in this way the gospel had become a topic of conversation in the capital, at the heart of the empire. And David Roper added this. He said, did any of these soldiers become Christians? According to uninspired tradition, some did. At least they came to understand what Paul represented. So they would have learned about the good news of Jesus. And if you think about it, the soldiers guarding him would have been the first to have had this letter as Paul was writing it, to have heard this letter as Paul was writing it. If he wrote it as he appears he usually did, through dictating it and someone serving as his scribe or secretary writing it down. These soldiers were learning about Jesus, and they were telling other soldiers about Paul and the Messiah he was imprisoned for. Paul would not have been able to influence that group of men if he had been free. He would never come into contact with these soldiers. His conditions, his reason for being a prisoner had become public knowledge. So being a prisoner wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something that Paul could use to glorify God. F.F. Bruce wrote, "He was a distinguished prisoner, a Roman citizen exercising his prerogative to have his case heard by the emperor. And he made sure that everyone who came in touch with him knew that it was on account of the gospel that he was under house arrest, and not because of subversive political activity or criminal conduct." The result of this not only was the influence on Roman soldiers. Notice what he next writes, that most of the brothers and sisters, you see, other Christians were more confident in talking to others about Jesus because of his imprisonment. In other words, being a prisoner did not make them fear to speak up. Perhaps it did initially, but no longer. The Greek word used here for speak, by the way, is not the usual term that's translated preach or to herald, literally, is what the Greek word means. That indicates a public proclamation. That's not the word used here now more than I ever dare to speak the word fearlessly. The word used here is an ordinary Greek word that emphasizes a day-to-day sharing the good news of Jesus in their conversations. As they saw that even the soldiers knew about Paul and his relationship with the Messiah, they were willing to speak up even more in telling others about Jesus in their lives. And they were doing this without fear. You see, Paul's situation was giving them confidence in their proclaiming the Messiah. David Roper said, "How did Paul's imprisonment give others courage? When they saw how Paul trusted in the Lord to take care of him, perhaps this increased their confidence in God. When they saw the apostle's assurance in spite of his troubles, maybe this gave them courage to face whatever ridicule might come. They may have reasoned that if God could do great things through a man in chains, he could also do great things through them." That's a good thought to think about, isn't it? And F.F. Bruce says, when Paul says that this is true of most of the brothers, he doesn't mean that there was a minority that refused to seize this opportunity for evangelization. He means that so many did so that their action characterized the Roman church as a whole. Nothing could have given Paul greater delight. Do you see the joy that's, though not mentioned by that word, that's coming through the text here? He is delighted that Christians are more bold in their proclamation of Jesus. So there's two positive results that Paul mentions here of his being a prisoner. He mentions that outsiders knew why he was a prisoner. The soldiers did. He mentions other outsiders as well. Those could have been referring to their commanders or something. Could be the officials that are in the area or others in the area as well. And the second good outcome is that believers were more bold because of his being a prisoner. That gave Paul cause for further joy. He continues talking about, in particular, about the Christians who are proclaiming, because there are some not doing it with the right motive, and he points this out. Verse 15, Some, to be sure, are preaching Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do so from love, because they know that I am placed here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, because they think they can cause trouble for me in my imprisonment. What's the result? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is being proclaimed, and in this I rejoice. Bruce describes this paragraph. He says this paragraph is described by Debelius, who's a commentator, as an excursus. Paul adds in passing to what he's just said that not all of those who have seized the opportunity for gospel witness were moved by equally worthy sentiments, but at least the opportunity has been seized, and that is cause for satisfaction. Have you ever thought about this? Why do people teach others about Jesus? I hope it's because of their love and concern for the person, that they want them to have what we have as Christians: forgiveness, a new life, hope for eternity. But apparently that's not the motive that some people have, or that some people have had in the past. And that's what Paul is experiencing. Again, Ralph Martin. They must be Christians who bore no love to the apostle personally, who were anxious to see him remain in prison, and who intended to make that imprisonment as galling and irksome as possible, deriving a malicious satisfaction, as a commentator named Heinzelman described it, from aggravating him in this way. In other words, there must have been Christians who really were just trying to make it more miserable for Paul, that they thought if they proclaimed the gospel even more, that it'd make Paul's conditions worse. Sad to think people would think like that, isn't it? Some were preaching the Messiah out of envy and rivalry. You know, when Paul says that, I don't know about you, that astonishes me. Can you imagine people teaching others because they were jealous of you? Maybe jealous of the influence and possibly even the success that was coming as a result of the work you were doing for Jesus? Can you imagine people seeing you not as a co-worker in the Lord, but as a rival, someone to be defeated? F.F. Bruce. Perhaps they were envious of Paul's achievements in carrying the message through so many provinces in such a brief space of time, and thought they could at least gain a march on him now that he was confined. Perhaps they regarded themselves as followers of some other leader, to whom in their eyes Paul was a rival. That's sort of harking back to the situation in Corinth that Paul recalls in the beginning of 1 Corinthians. Now that Paul was no longer free to move around, their own leader's cause could make better progress. Now, having been astonished about Paul saying that, they're doing it out of envy and rivalry, I would have to admit that in my life, I have seen this. I have seen Christians, almost, the word I would use is wooing other Christians, by taking them out for meals, by giving them gifts in an attempt to take someone else's influence away and to replace it with their own influence, almost like they're trying to buy their affections. Of course, the good news from my observation is that when this has happened, people tend to see through it. But this is what was happening to Paul at this time. Envy, rivalry. Wiersbe wrote that envy and strife, or rivalry, go together just as love and unity go together. So there wasn't love and unity that they had, it was the envy and rivalry. But the good thing is, we find this in the text, is that fortunately it was not the majority of people. Others were teaching Jesus with the right motivation. They were looking for the good of the other person. They were doing it out of love. Undoubtedly because they loved people, But it seems as it was also because of their love and respect for Paul. They would have seen themselves as partners with Paul in the good news of Jesus. They knew why Paul was in Rome, why he was a prisoner. He was there to defend the good news of Jesus, which he had been proclaiming in Jerusalem when he'd been arrested because of the Jews' reaction to his message of taking the good news to Gentiles. Because of this, the Jews hated Paul and wanted him dead. Twice they had tried to kill him. Just after his arrest, if you remember, a group of more than 40 Jews took an oath to not eat or drink until Paul was dead. And the Jewish leaders worked with him to try to get the Roman commander to take Paul back to the Sanhedrin as if they wanted more accurate information. In reality, the plan was for Paul to be ambushed and killed. Of course, that didn't happen. He was moved instead to Caesarea. I think somehow those 40 Jews broke their oath. But 2 years later, they tried it again. This time to have a new Roman procurator, Festus, to take Paul to Jerusalem for trial. And again, they planned an ambush to kill Paul. And that's when Paul ended up having to appeal to Caesar. And that's why he was in Rome as a prisoner. And the Christians there saw this as what God wanted. That God had sent Paul to Rome to defend the good news of Jesus. Again, Ralph Martin, using the phrase from the King James Version, I am set for the defense of the gospel. He says the Greek word is chemai. He says it's a military term, emphasizing the point that in prison he is enduring hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ, and is as much on duty as the guards who are posted to watch him are on duty in the service of Rome. F.F. Bruce adds, if Paul, despite his restrictions, was promoting the interests of the gospel, those people of goodwill could do no less. They must play their part along with him. And this seems to be their mindset. There were those who were proclaiming Jesus from selfish ambition. You see, they really were interested in people becoming followers of Jesus. They were interested in promoting themselves. They were trying to cause Paul more trouble as a prisoner. And the Greek word here for cause trouble, or maybe your translation has stir up trouble, it's a Greek word thalepsis. And it literally talks about friction. The painful rubbing of chains on wrists and ankles would be sort of the thought there. But you see, they were doing this to cause Paul friction. They're doing this really to irritate Paul. Their motives were far from right. They wanted to promote their own influence, possibly as a teacher, or maybe to have people loyal to them. But at the same time, they wanted to harm Paul. F.F. Bruce wrote that they were evidently jealous of Paul's record and prestige as a preacher of the gospel. Anything he could do, they could do better. They would let it be seen that they came behind him in no respect. The news of what they were doing, they thought and hoped, would fill Paul with chagrin and frustration. And when I read about what they're doing, I'm so impressed with Paul's next statement. What's the result of all this? The result is Jesus was being proclaimed. Ralph Martin writes, this statement has to do exclusively with the motives of the rival groups within the church, not with the content of their preaching. You see, it didn't matter if it was pretending to be sincere or if they really were interested in the salvation of others. The result was the same. People were getting to know Jesus. And because of that, Paul could rejoice. There's joy as a result. F.F. Bruce wrote, but if they thought Paul would be annoyed or resentful, they mistook their man. If they were more successful than he in propagating the gospel, that was all to the good in Paul's eyes. His preeminent concern was that the saving message might spread rapidly and be honored. He could treat unfriendly attitudes with relaxed indifference. What did it matter so long as Christ was being preached? See, what mattered was the content of what was being proclaimed, not the identity of who was doing it. The problem wasn't the message, but the motive of the messengers. By the way, maybe examining ourselves, maybe then questioning someone else's motive, we should be examining our own motives and let the Lord judge the motives of others. David Roper wrote, "What can we learn from Philippians 1:18? We can learn not to clutter our minds with destructive thoughts of mistreatment. Those who dwell on real or imagined mistreatment are miserable. Further, we can learn to appreciate the good people do, even when we suspect that they may not be doing that good from the purest of motives. We need to look for the positive in others, not the negative." See, for Paul, there was joy in the fact that the name of Jesus was being proclaimed far and wide. Ralph Martin, and we'll close the lesson part with this, wrote that indeed his very confinement, so far from curtailing the ministry of the word, has led to an extension of the gospel. And even the rivalry and misdirected zeal of his fellow Christians in the place of his captivity cannot obscure the all-important fact that the message of Christ is being preached. As we think about that section of text, let's think for just a few minutes about what lessons there are for us in this text. And most of these I've put in the form of questions. I like questions because hopefully they get us to think about our own situations. Do we have joy even when our circumstances are not ideal? By the way, Paul's going to talk more about this as we get on down into the text. Warren Wiersbe wrote, "Paul did not find his joy in ideal circumstances. He found his joy in winning others to Christ. And if his circumstances promoted the furtherance of the gospel, that was all that mattered. Instead of finding himself confined as a prisoner, Paul discovered that his circumstances really opened up new areas of ministry." Another question for us. How do we react when all doesn't go our way? Do we bitterly complain and try to create opposition to those who don't see things our way? Or do we rejoice that the good news of Jesus is being proclaimed? I even know of people, when things don't go their way, they give up. They think, well, I'm not needed. They don't listen to me. And it may be that sometimes we need to listen to others. Do we ask God, by the way, to use our circumstances, even if they are not ideal, to further the work of the kingdom? David Roper wrote that perhaps you've heard the adage, when life hands you a lemon, make lemonade. The illustration is vivid. Lemon juice by itself is sour, but a little lemon juice mixed with cool water and sugar makes lemonade a refreshing drink. The analogy is apt. Life sometimes hands us lemons, distasteful circumstances. When that happens, we can merely try to endure the situation, or we can try to find the good in it. We can make our lemons into lemonade. I think people that I have observed more often than not choose to give up rather than see the good in a situation. Do we see beyond what we might see as our bonds? I've heard of mothers especially, but sometimes fathers as well, who see their family as a hindrance to what they want to do as a Christian. They look forward to the day they're free from this hindrance, and sometimes even decide to forsake their families to be free, to do what they want to do. See, rather than seeing our children or our families as something that holds us back, the we should be seeing them as something that enhances our lives and how we live as a Christian. Think about this. Our children can be the means of reaching others with the good news of Jesus. When our children were in school, particularly in primary school, that was for us a great way to get to know other parents. And we even saw Bible studies set up with some parents and some becoming Christians. We had loads of conversations about being a Christian as a result of having children in school. Wiersbe writes, "The secret is this. When you have the single mind, as he calls it, you should look on your circumstances as God-given opportunities for the furtherance of the gospel, and you rejoice at what God is going to do, instead of complaining about what God did not do." Another lesson for us, or another question for us. Does our faith give others confidence to speak a good word for Jesus? Do our lives discourage people or encourage people? I knew of a lady many years ago. She died very young mother of cancer. But she was a Christian. She was a faithful Christian. And even when cancer was getting the better of her, she was undergoing treatment, She was concerned about others, not about herself. She would frequently phone me to ask me to pray for certain individuals who were going through difficulties. And we would chat. And those calls encouraged me because I saw the faith that she had. Wiersbe comments that discouragement has a way of spreading, but so does encouragement. Because of Paul's joyful attitude, the believers in Rome took fresh courage and witnessed boldly for Christ. Another question. Are we able to rejoice even when people are criticizing and opposing us? By the way, that's difficult, but are we able to do it? As David Roper points out, Paul was not concerned about Paul. He was concerned about the gospel. He was not upset about what critics thought of him, but rejoiced that the gospel was being preached. And finally, a thought. Christians should not be competing with each other. We should be working together. And that's vital. We're not in competition with each other. Roper wrote, each of us needs to examine why we do what we do for the cause of Christ. Do we work at certain tasks because we lack the praise or attention? Do we quit if we feel we are not appreciated? May God help us to serve him from pure motives. Thank you for joining us for this particular lesson, and we hope you'll join us for our next lesson. Right now, I'm entitling it, if you notice these titles do change between recordings sometimes, but I'm titling it The Joy of Living for Jesus. And we'll be looking at the rest of chapter 1. Hope you have a good rest of the day wherever you are, and continue thinking about how we can better serve Jesus and find the joy in our lives that Jesus brings.